Lights out. So we haven't covered David Lynch a whole lot on this channel, and if you know me in my real life and you've had conversations with me for any amount of time, you might see that as a really unusual thing because I love David Lynch. Lynch is one of my very favorite directors, and some of his films occupy a very rare air in conversation with me. Mulholland Drive, I think, is one of the last modern masterpieces of cinema, not just horror, but cinema itself. And although great films come out all the time, if you're willing to look high and low to find them, there's something about Lynch's cinema that bridges classic Hollywood with modern and even postmodern cinema. Lynch is a transformative artist, but he's not transformative for film. And that's important. He's not leading film to a place. There isn't a ton of Lynch imitators out there. There have been films that have been called Lynchian, and there's films that I consider to be very much a tribute to David Lynch. But remarkably few when you consider the amount of people who are influenced by, say, Spielberg or even someone like a John Landis. And everyone knows my feelings on John Landis. Lynch is almost like Cronenberg in that any attempt to be too much like the original artist is just doomed because you're going to be compared to that original artist. So it's kind of a losing battle. But David Lynch has a fan base that's perhaps unlike any other fan base in film. And that's one of the reasons I haven't spoken about David Lynch very much on this channel. The truth is, Lynch fans aren't like herding cats, because you can always shake a treat bottle and all the cats will come running. Lynch fans all have their own ideas that they will die on every hill they ever have climbed when it comes to the subject. And not just that, they can become pretty vicious about their viewpoints. So before I begin really in earnest, I just want to say, everyone take a deep breath. I'm going to say things here that you're going to disagree with probably. And isn't that a wonderful thing? Isn't it great that we can talk about an artist and that's part of the story? So much of our cinema today is interchangeable. So much lacks any kind of imprint or voice. Lynch is the opposite of that. Lynch at his worst is still interesting. Now, Lynch at his worst is something I don't want to revisit either. But there's a power to an original voice. And exploring an original voice is always going to lead to original interpretations. This video is not a storytelling autopsy. I'm not going to go through Lynch's catalog and tell you what he means by anything. And he would hate that if I did it, because to him, what it means as a creator shouldn't be the same thing as what it means as a viewer. And every viewer should come to their own dream state inside of a film and come to their own meanings because they have to apply it to their own lives. That's a completely legitimate way to view film. Is it a little erudite? Is it a little bit preposterous to say that every film belongs to the viewer and that no director's intention really matters? Well, yeah, it is. But wouldn't you rather have that kind of pretentiousness, perhaps, involved in art than the opposite? Whereas we just crank out Transformers movies until the money finally dries up? David Lynch, as an artist, has never been shy about making dark films that explore extremely dark emotions. And the whole dark emotions issue is completely how I define the horror genre. You know that if you've seen the beginning of any of my videos. So why isn't he then normally considered when we talk about the top horror directors of all time. Certainly he's been one of the most successful directors in film history, period. On a critical scale, definitely. So why doesn't he get the honor? We'll take a look at that as we go through his career. Now, I'm not going to cover every film in his career because I don't consider everything he's done to be horror. I think you could argue that there's elements of horror in all of his work. I'm not going to cover the straight story, but I think there is a real point to be made that a film about coming to grips with your own mortality, well, that's kind of the ultimate horror film in a way. However, stylistically and in intent, that's not its purpose. So I do think it falls outside the genre to me personally. But we will cover films here that you may not consider horror films. Recently, in a discussion with people over a list of a website's choice for top 100 horror films of all time, there was people arguing that certain films didn't belong, they weren't really horror films, and that other films did belong on the list that weren't included. We have to accept a wide tent for horror, because if we don't, the whole point of the genre, which is really to explore what we fear in a moment, what our anxiety is today, gets lost. David Lynch has been exploring anxiety explicitly for his entire career in one shape or form. And that begins in Philadelphia. If you've ever been to Philadelphia, you know that Philadelphians understand anxiety. Eraserhead. It's probably hard to imagine today, but there was a time when the midnight movie was an event like a rock concert. Theaters would play a very specific type of film during midnight showings. Rocky Horror Picture Show is, of course, the best known and longest running of these titles, but Pink Floyd The Wall was another, Pink Flamingos. Eraserhead was one that would pop on and off of the circuit regularly, more commonly in college towns, but throughout the Midnight Madness showings. And the reason is very simple. Eraserhead is as close to a dream as any film has ever come. Lynch crafted a nightmarish, but oddly, not scary, film about fatherhood, about adulthood, about misplaced dreams, about where our culture has gone wrong, about our lack of communication, and finally, a film that's about lack of connection. The visual vocabulary of Eraserhead resonates throughout his entire filmography, and it's important to remember that this comes at a time when there was really nothing like it. There was experimental films, and certainly the entire Andy Warhol factory was producing things that were strange. But there was nothing like Eraserhead. Eraserhead is a narrative that's told almost entirely visually. In fact, you could remove pretty much the dialogue from the film, and it probably would hold up just as well. That's because Lynch wasn't dealing with the psychological on any kind of overt level. He was dealing with it on a very introspective level, one that he may not have even been fully aware of himself, though I think when you look at Eraserhead, it's a lot more contained and controlled than his later works. The idea of unwanted fatherhood, too early and in a world that seems dying, creates a lot of cascading moral panic in the viewer. Even though Lynch has a great sense of humor about most of his scenes, and overall I wouldn't say the film has a dour personality at all. Henry's always looking to try and find the humanity in the situation. It's just fleeting when he does. There's an undercurrent throughout this entire film that Henry is truly alone. And the idea of adding a child to a world that's full of such deep, droning loneliness, that's the real horror here. It's not that the child keeps him up at night. It's that the child does is keeps him up to observe more of that world. It's not the artificial chicken that Mary X's father has made for dinner. It's that our world has slowly become a place where artificial food is more and more common and accepted. There's been a recent news article how in our lifetimes we devour an amount of plastic that in previous generations they would have believed toxic, but is actually part of our body's internal processing now. Lynch had no way of knowing that, and that's not an idea that's present in Eraserhead, but it fits in perfectly with a world where synthetic but seemingly alive chickens that are already cooked on a plate bleed and shriek, where premature babies have monstrous appearances and exist without anything to hold their internal organs together except the swathing that their parents have put on them. Eraserhead is a horror film for every parent who got to that status in life too early. It's also a film about society as a whole working towards an end that is distinctly post-human. The industrial landscapes might remind you of a Pink Floyd album cover, and the just desperation that's in every film frame would probably put you in mind that this is a film meant to be an assault on the senses. But honestly, it's the opposite. The film is strangely calming and soothing. It doesn't point fingers at anyone. It's not a political tract. It's asking us what we think of ourselves and the world that we've allowed to be born around us. And ultimately, that rejection of that world, that rejection of the idea of having to stay awake by a child's screams at night, is what the film is saying. Now, I said I wasn't going to just explain what these movies are, and that's not my intent here. Eraserhead is open to interpretation to anyone with eyes, and that's both a brilliant thing, and it's also the thing that makes us keep going back to it. It's enigmatic, it's dark, it's off-putting, it's thoughtful, it's soulful, and it's the birthplace of a new kind of cinematic voice. Lynch's horror film doesn't just go boo. It asks you why you go boo. The Elephant Man is the strangest horror film in history. And it's that way because David Lynch made a horror film in all the conventional visual senses of the word, but did not include any of the range of emotions that normally we associate with the genre, and certainly that I associate with the genre on the start of every one of my videos. But it unmistakably looks like a horror film and feels like a horror film. It just doesn't evoke the emotions that you'd expect. So what exactly is The Elephant Man? Is it a weird hybrid accident, or was this intentional? Truth is, it's the most gentle kind of tribute to a type of movie that was no longer being made by the time Eraserhead was complete and David Lynch was ready to move on to his next, more commercial project. The Elephant Man looks and feels like a Frankenstein movie, with its protagonist being shunned by society, not asking for his affliction, constantly trying to duck and hide, and to always avoid the association with being a monster. But the title tells you something, right? The title of the film is not John Merrick, it is The Elephant Man, a provocative exploitation title. And the film looks very much like a Universal film from the late 30s. Not quite as blocky as the early part of the decade, but certainly something after the 1936 and 37 horror mandated drought, in which Universal were finding their foot and figuring out how these films should look for the matinee audience. It also captures a little bit of the flair of the Val Lewton era of filmmaking 10 years on from that, in that it has all these sharp angles and seamless transitions. It's the kind of film where visually what is happening does not really match the story being told, but that mismatch is what makes it beautiful and special. The Elephant Man ultimately decides to take us on the journey that the Universal films only could hope to. Frankenstein's monster, especially in Bride of Frankenstein, is not the villain of the work. The society that rejects him, that forces his hand into monstrous behavior, is the villain. But the film stops short there by giving us Dr. Pretorius, a surrogate villain that we can boo all in unison in the movie theater. The Elephant Man doesn't let you have that same luxury. Instead, the mad doctors are doctors that want to actually help the patient and make his life bearable, make society have some reference point to people who are different. It's a film about the outsider in the same way that Frankenstein was a film about the outsider. The difference is the villain, make no mistake about it, is the torch-bearing villagers. And in this case, both literally and metaphorically, that's also us, the audience, who showed up to see a film called The Elephant Man. There is a lot of horror in David Lynch's Dune, but we're not going to cover that film because even though there's shocking images in the film, and those that are definitely meant to evoke dread and horror and disgust, the overall point of that film is really divorced from the spectrum of emotions that horror evokes. So even though he uses the horror vocabulary at times, he's not telling that story with those words. Eraserhead, Elephant Man, and Dune form a weird sort of trilogy of Lynch movies set in very exotic fantasy worlds. Interesting, then, that he chooses a very normal setting for his return to horror proper, Blue Velvet. Now, Blue Velvet looks like a thriller from the 50s, and sounds like it often too, but that is a mirage. That is the surface level. And it neatly mirrors the fact that it's a movie about a young college kid who suspects that there's more to his town than just the suburban sprawl he sees around him. He suspects of something much darker, and he's right. Just like the movie looks like a 50s thriller, but is hiding something far darker, something more properly belonging to the horror genre. Horror has a deep connection with the fairy tale. And the reason for that is there's really never been any writers that have been more influential to the genre than the Brothers Grimm or Anderson. The basic story, the morality story that forms fairy tales is very similar to the mortality and morality stories that form horror. And although they're not perfect matches, it's not apples to apples, they still have a lot in common, so they share a lot of the same foundation. Lynch is using the troll bridge analogy here, whereas a character wants to go on a quest to another land but has to cross a bridge. And of course there's a troll that stands between him and that new horizon. That troll in this film is Frank Booth, a character who lives in the periphery of the normal, safe world, but is intricately important to the darker world underneath. Lynch uses Booth as a monster in the true sense. He's Dracula, he is the Mummy, he is every demonic entity that's ever possessed any teenage girl. He just happens to have a bad taste in beer and a good taste in rides. Sounds like America to me. At the same time, Lynch is using the social criticism of the American small town's hypocrisy, which most mainstream critics latched onto as the most important thing about this film. The reality is Blue Velvet is a morality story about voyeurism. And again, it's Lynch turning that camera on us, a theme that we'll see for the remainder of his career. This is a film really about the audience, because we're watching the film to see a horrific rape sequence involving a pair of scissors. Who buys a ticket to see that? Why are we interested in it? And why is it so satisfying at the same time it's disgusting and horrifying when it actually happens on screen? Why do we find Frank Booth so compelling? He should be a character that we absolutely want off screen. We wouldn't want to look or know someone like this, right? We'd want them divorced from our world. And yet, like Jeffrey in the movie, we seek him out. Lynch is once again not interested in just telling the surface level horror movie, but he's using the horror movie to reflect the audience's sensibilities, say something about us directly. The critics all thought this is a film about society, but Lynch seems to be saying that society is just the plural of the singular I, and that we're all hypocritically responsible for the horrible world that we've created. Now, horror at its best gives us a sense of release from those problems. Now, it's not therapeutic. I've been down that road many times on this channel. Do not use horror as therapy. It's a bad idea. But it allows us to look at the things that truly disturb us and the things that we find disquieting and put them in a context that is safe enough that we can actually look at them. Because no one wants to look at school shootings in the real world with any real clarity. We want our simple heroes and villains, right? We don't want to have to look at all the issues attached to them because there aren't perhaps easy solutions available that will comprehensively solve a problem like that. Blue Velvet isn't about a school shooting, but it most definitely is about the collapse of the social structure, that social contract that kept us all safe and happy and provided some sense of security. Lynch strips that away as the film goes on, and then pulls a brilliant trick at the end, whereas a return to normalcy seems, well, false. It's kind of like at the end of Wizard of Oz when we return from Oz and notice that the real world still kind of feels like fantasy. But here there's a darker side of that because we know that there's still streets in every town where people shouldn't go at night. The first time you watch Lost Highway, it's easy to see why the film initially was regarded as incoherent or overly artistically pretentious. But in reality, it's actually one of Lynch's most straightforward horror films. It's a film about a murder, or more than one murder, but there's definitely a murder at its core. And it's not a film that makes that murder a simple, easy thing. It's not a mystery in the cozy mystery sense. The film internalizes the violence and the emotions that come with that murder. And it's not about motive. Because motive is just why we do something. It's not how we get to the mindset that allows us to justify, compartmentalize, and maybe even erase, like you'd erase a videotape, that memory. Lost Highway is a vicious, dark horror noir that in many ways is Lynch's most pessimistic film. The vaguely supernatural elements, which of course we're talking about that same kind of Twilight area where is something supernatural or is it just a psychological defense mechanism, that's at play. But if we'll call them supernatural elements, what they are conspiring to do is tell a story from an emotional and a guarded emotional stance. A story of a man who murders his wife. Probably. That ambiguity is what has always made Lynch compelling. But what makes him an absolutely master filmmaker is that he wraps this mystery inside a gothic horror film. Is the mystery man any less of a terrifying figure than the one that haunts our protagonist in Carnival of Souls, a film Lynch has regarded as one of his favorites? The time displacement issue, the Mobius strip nature of the narrative, is a really innovative way to tell a story about someone trying to come to grips with what they did. And the notion that our darkest places, those things we bury deep inside, those things that we like that we know are not socially acceptable, which I would argue is why we like the horror genre, is it gives us a way to explore all the stuff that you say in polite company that you want to explore, you're going to get ostracized. This film takes us there. It's a world where crime bosses and porn producers and affairs and trysts in the desert, All this stuff is at the same time really gaudy and really socially unacceptable, but at the same rate, it's compelling and even attractive and in its own way beautiful because it's true. That cognitive dissonance that the main character feels about the murder, well, we feel that sort of about the experience of watching a truly disturbing horror film. You shouldn't be completely comfortable when you watch something like Cannibal Holocaust, or even Psycho in its day, which dealt with themes of the relationship between a man and his mother in isolation. Exploring those kind of themes is always dangerous for any filmmaker, but for one that is instinctual and relies on how he feels, like Lynch does, rather than by a screenplay that makes sense, well, it provides a really singular experience. But make no mistake, this is a film that means to disturb you by holding that mirror up to you. It means to be transcendent, but also deeply unsettling. Lost Highway is amazing in that it was a commercial film made and released for a general audience. Lynch would have exactly one more chance to hit that audience squarely in the face with his corrosive blend of seductive cinema. My personal favorite David Lynch film is Mulholland Drive. And there was a lot of reasons going in to watch that film in a small theater in Montclair, New Jersey. Because it didn't get a very wide theatrical release. You had to kind of find that college theater that played the offbeat stuff. But there's a lot of reasons, really, it shouldn't have even approached my favorite David Lynch film. It was later in his career. It seemed very similar thematically to his previous work, Lost Highway. And it started as a television pilot that was rejected and then retrofit into a film. There was a lot of reasons this shouldn't have worked at all or been at least a lesser entry in the Lynch filmography. And yet I came out of the theater feeling like I'd just watched the culmination of one of my favorite film careers. Mulholland found the perfect vehicle for the Lynchian story, which was film itself. The very nature of performing for film, the very nature of film being a distracting and quite often very misleading art form. You could argue that the entire history of film is finding creative ways to lie to people, and Mulholland Drive is about that. It takes all the same themes that we've been discussing throughout the Lynch films and siphons them through the world of filmmaking. And by using that technique, it allows us to play with the avant-garde and the metaphysical in a way that the previous films were a little bit handcuffed. This is a mystery, it is a puzzle. It's a film to be thought of afterwards and deciphered, and for it to be a personal experience for you that's not going to perfectly match with anyone else's experiences. And that is the core of what Lynch has always brought to film. And that way he's more similar to someone like a Fellini than he is to someone like a Steven Spielberg. And maybe that's not a surprise for anyone to hear, but when you think about the times in which Lynch has made his films, you'd think that since both Spielberg and Lynch are both trying to reflect kind of the perfect vision of America and the failings of America, they'd be similar. But in reality, they share almost nothing from a filmmaking standpoint. And maybe that has to do with the commercial appeal of their films or their intent for commercial appeal. But bigger than that, I think, it's just a matter of Lynch being uncompromising. When he feels something's true, he does it. And in the case of a film about lies, a truthful film about lies becomes the perfect Lynch vehicle. Great performances all around certainly make this probably the best performed of any film in his filmography. Certainly, at least since Elephant Man, but I think this does surpass that. It's a fearless film that I think a different director with less of a reputation would not have been able to get away with some of what he gets away with here. It's bold, it's violent, it's crass, it is surreal in an extraordinarily dangerous way. It uses imagery that in other hands could come off as way too broad, but there's something grounded in this nightmare, literally in this nightmare. A lot of people compare it with Lost Highway because there seems to be conflicting narratives like there is in Lost Highway. But here, it's not a matter of taking an outside form so that you can contextualize an event in your life. That's not what's going on here. On the surface, it seems to be. But in reality, it's something much more tragic. Because this is not about pain you've inflicted on others. This is about an apocalyptic personal self-destruction. So while I think Lost Highway is the darker film, I think Mulholland Drive says more about us as an audience than as a society. There's no way not to feel awkward and strange while you watch the film. There's no way to try and piece together all the pieces and come to the conclusion that you understand this film 100%. That's the point. It all fits together. I think I understand the narrative. I certainly have my take on it. But the fact is you shouldn't ever come to 100% with a film like this. And make no mistake, this is a horror film forward and back. Again, themes of murder and forbidden relationships and regret and personality disorders, and the fact that perhaps the guy controlling it all is a homeless person who lives behind a dumpster of a diner in what has to be the most terrifying sequence in modern film history. It's simple, it's effective, it'll bring to mind that famous hallway scene from Exorcist 3 on a simple level, but there's a lot more going on. The fact that Lynch can take a broad daylight scene and make you question the entire reality of the narrative up to that point and how you feel about him as a filmmaker. You cannot trust Lynch after that scene, and that's the point. This is dangerous horror filmmaking. Unlike Lost Highway, this is not a gothic film. This is a postmodernist take. So they're also different in that respect, even though the two films are joined in the filmography in a way that they can't be separated. You have to almost look at those two films as mirror images of each other. But they're dark mirrors of each other because they actually share very little in common if you dig into the actual subject matter, the themes, and what the film is accomplishing. Mulholland Drive is a classic horror film. It's also a classic film period. It's a classic of modern cinema. This is David Lynch's masterwork. And if it doesn't unsettle you, if it doesn't make you question how you feel about film and what you want out of film, then I really don't know where you go from here. Because there is very few films that accomplish as much as this one does that have ever been made. So David Lynch, body of work that arguably can't be compared to anyone else. A singular filmmaker with a vision who's always gone for exactly what he wants and has remarkably almost always gotten it on the screen. We didn't cover all of his films in this video, and I said we wouldn't. There's some that just fall outside of the horror genre, no matter how you define the horror genre. And there are a few that it'd be difficult for me to say are successful on any level, so to cover them basically becomes talking about an artist at their least successful, which I don't want to do. But I wanted to make clear that this is a filmmaker who brings so much passion to telling a vision to the screen. And that's something that we have in such short supply today that we should celebrate Lynch every day. If you haven't seen any of the films we've covered, please watch them. I just wanted to recap a little bit. Lynch started his career delving into the outsider, a man who feels at odds with the strange world around him, an industrial landscape filled with morality he can't understand, people who barely communicate, thrown into a world where he's now no longer the child but the father, and he's not ready for it. And from there we went to a world where as an outsider who physically didn't resemble all those around him was just looking for a little bit of acceptance in a world where no one was ready to accept. And it doesn't take a big step for us to get to Lynch that taking a peek under the carpet of our society to say what's really going on as opposed to what we claim is going on in the nice suburban neighborhoods. Ultimately, we're talking about the psychology of a people, of a culture, of a land, and how it's not really what we pretend it to be. And even in our personal lives, we start to rewrite our own narratives and create a different identity for ourselves because it's more comforting. In his magnum opus, Mulholland Drive, Lynch puts it all together and starts talking about how mass media, in this case film, takes all of our personal anxieties that we're trying to rewrite and pretend are different and project them on a screen as something safe and secure and wonderful. At the same time, Lynch is making a film that disrupts all of that. The beauty of Lynch's career is that it's all one statement. It's all coming to one conclusion. We're going to cover Twin Peaks in an upcoming video because in many ways Twin Peaks finishes the statement. I still believe that everything you need to know about David Lynch's career you can get from just watching the movies we covered here. The big statements are made. Peaks is kind of the denouncement at the end of the treatise. It's that final statement in many, many parts, but largely in 4 parts. 3 seasons of a television series and 1 really, really important film that I considered covering here because it is overtly a horror movie, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. But it'd be too odd to cover Fire Walk with Me without covering the rest of it, and this video would be twice as long if I did cover it. Hopefully, Lynch's very specific journey through the American psyche has been as meaningful for you as it has been for me. And if you're missing any pieces of this journey, please go out and check them out.
Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff.
What? Wait. What?
I watched like 3 movies from 2021.